In a classroom on the Navajo Nation today, a teacher can begin the day in Diné Bizard. Children answer in the same language. The words are spoken aloud, written on a board, used for instruction, and carried home again. That scene may look ordinary. Historically, it is not. For generations, federal Indian boarding schools were built around an assimilation project. The U.S. Department of the Interior now states plainly that the goal of Indian education in that era was to assimilate native children. Students were forbidden from speaking their languages and prevented from practicing traditional cultural life. Diné children were part of that larger system, whether they attended schools close to home or were sent farther away. How did the Navajo language survive institutions designed to push it aside? The answer is not that the schools failed to cause harm. They did. The answer is that a language is not stored in one building, one textbook, or one federal policy. It lives in families, in ordinary work, in stories, in humour, in place names, and in the decisions people make about what children will hear tomorrow. The language is often called Navajo in English. Diné Bizard is a name used within the language itself. It is part of a living Diné world, not a code, not a museum object, and not a decorative addition to English. Its sounds, grammar, and ways of forming meaning carry relationships that cannot be reduced to a vocabulary list. That is why the history cannot start with the boarding school. Diné Bizard existed long before federal teachers tried to regulate it. Families used it to organize daily life across a vast homeland spanning parts of present-day Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. Children learned through participation, listening, watching, answering, helping, and being corrected by people around them. The language moved through households because households were where much of life happened. The federal school system introduced a different model. It separated many native children from their normal networks of instruction and placed English at the center of schooling. The policy did not only teach a new language, it treated indigenous languages as obstacles to be removed. The National Museum of the American Indian preserves public educational material that includes the words of Navajo students who recalled being told not to speak their language. That order created a painful contradiction. A child could speak Diné Bizard at home and be punished, corrected, or shamed for it at school. The same ability that connected a child to parents and grandparents could be labelled a problem by an institution claiming to educate them. The record should make us cautious. We cannot assign the same memory to every family. School locations, decades, teachers, and individual experiences varied. But the policy itself is documented. The Interior Department describes language prohibition as part of the assimilation era. That is the historical fact this documentary follows. The first evidence is therefore not a dramatic artifact. It is a rule about speech. A rule can appear small on paper. In daily life, it changes who can answer freely, which words are safe to use, and whether children learn to connect school knowledge with home knowledge. Yet rules also have limits. A school could control a classroom. It could not fully control a kitchen table, a sheep camp, a trading post, a chapter house, or a visit with grandparents. The next part of this history is about that distance between institutional power and the places where a language continued to be spoken. That difference between school time and home time was never trivial. A language is learned through repetition, but repetition is not only a drill. It is hearing the same word while someone points to an object, asks a question, gives a direction, tells a story, or responds to a child's mistake. The daily setting changes the meaning of the word. It makes language practical before anyone calls it heritage. Federal institutions could prescribe English in their classrooms, issue schedules, and set punishments. They could not turn every Diné household into an English-only household. They could make transmission harder. They could produce silence in particular rooms. They could leave people carrying painful memories of school. But the public record of later Navajo language education makes sense only because speakers and families kept enough of the language in use for a new generation of educators to build from it. This is the first limit on the phrase "tried to silence." It describes a policy and its effects. It does not mean the policy gained total control over Diné life. The documentary must hold both facts together. The pressure was real, and the language continued through people who were never merely passive recipients of that pressure. Boarding school policy was designed to make English the language of advancement, and to make indigenous languages appear temporary or improper. But Diné Bizard did not depend on official approval. It remained in family life, community life, and the everyday knowledge that schools could not fully replace. This survival should not be romanticized. Keeping a language alive under pressure asks people to make difficult choices. Some parents and grandparents had learned, through direct experience, that English could be necessary for dealing with schools, jobs, courts, and the wider United States. They wanted children to have opportunities that had been denied to them. Other family members worried that English-only schooling would break a chain of understanding. Both concerns could exist in the same household. That complexity is important. The story is not English versus Diné Bizard, as if one language must erase the other. The issue was who had the power to decide which language children were allowed to use, and whether Diné families could teach their own children without punishment or shame. During World War II, this contradiction became visible to Americans who had barely noticed it before. Diné Marines used their language to build and operate the Navajo Code. Many had grown up in schools that discouraged or forbade the language that later became central to a military communication system. That history belongs to another episode in this channel, but here it serves one narrow purpose. It shows how federal policy could suppress a language in one setting, while the government valued its speakers in another. The contradiction did not repair the older harm. It did demonstrate that Diné Bizard was never a barrier to intelligence, discipline, or modern life. It was a complex language carried by people who adapted it to an extraordinary task. After the war, public recognition of code talkers would become one visible part of a wider shift in how many Americans discuss native languages. But public recognition alone did not ensure transmission to children. Language transmission is physical. Someone has to speak. Someone has to listen. Someone has to answer. A child needs repeated chances to use words before those words become effortless. This is why schools matter, but not as the only answer. A class can create time, materials, teachers, and accountability. A family gives the language its daily range. Meals, jokes, directions, corrections, affection, and the names of local places. The Navajo Nation's educational materials make that connection explicit. The Diné culture and language curriculum framework treats language and culture as part of education, rather than as an extracurricular decoration. Its purpose is not merely to preserve a set of old words. It places Diné knowledge within a system intended to serve Navajo students and the sovereignty of the Navajo Nation. That word, sovereignty, changes the historical frame. In the assimilation era, outside authorities set the rules and measured success by distance from indigenous language and practice. In a Diné-controlled educational framework, Navajo institutions define goals for Diné learners. The language is no longer something students must hide from a school. It can become part of what school is for. This did not happen in one clean turn. Federal policy changed over time. Tribal governments expanded educational authority, communities developed programs, and teachers created materials. Progress was uneven. Numbers alone cannot tell us which children speak confidently at home, which parents have time to participate, or which communities have enough fluent teachers. The most honest account has to hold that uncertainty. Still, the change in direction is concrete. The next record is a handbook, not a treaty or a war dispatch, but a practical document for full Diné language immersion in early grades. It shows the language returning to a place where earlier policy had tried to narrow it, the daily routine of a classroom. The difference can be seen in the kind of record each era leaves behind. Assimilation policy recorded rules, attendance, discipline, and a desired distance from indigenous life. A language immersion handbook records classroom routines, instructional planning, and the conditions needed for children to hear and use Diné Bizard. One system treats the language as a problem to be managed. The other treats it as a medium through which children can learn. Neither document is neutral. Each reveals who had authority to set the purpose of education. That is why an educational handbook deserves as much attention in this story as an old school building. It is evidence that the argument over language moved from an imposed rule toward a Navajo-designed practice. An immersion program works through repetition, but it is a different kind of repetition from the old school rule. The earlier system repeated English-only authority. A full Diné language program repeats Diné Bizard across greetings, instructions, objects, questions, games, songs appropriate for public classroom use, and the small exchanges that make a child comfortable speaking. The Navajo Nation's Handbook for K2 Full Diné Language Immersion records an effort to build that environment deliberately. It was developed through Navajo educational institutions, not imposed as an outside experiment. That distinction matters. A language program is strongest when the people responsible for its future shape the goals, materials, and standards. The work is more demanding than translating an English worksheet. A teacher needs language fluency, but also time, training, classroom resources, and a way to make instruction meaningful across subjects. Children need enough exposure that the language is not confined to one brief period in the day. Families need access to materials and support that fit real schedules. School leaders must make room in standards, budgets, and hiring. This is where the word survived needs care. Survival is not a finish line. A language can remain present while facing serious pressure. A community can have fluent elders and still worry about whether enough children will become speakers. A school can have an immersion program and still need more teachers, more resources, and more time. The records support the existence of Navajo Nation programs. They do not authorize a simple claim that every problem has been solved. The stronger claim is also more interesting. Diné Bizard survived because it was carried through social systems that were never completely erased. Then Diné educators and institutions created new systems to strengthen it. Family transmission and formal instruction are not competitors. They are two different routes that can meet in the same child. Consider the physical difference between the two classrooms. In the assimilation model, language was treated as evidence of failure. A child's first language could mark them as someone needing correction. In an immersion classroom, the language is a tool for learning. It can be used to count, describe weather, ask for help, explain a process, and speak with classmates. The change is not only emotional, it changes what the classroom considers knowledge. The public curriculum materials also connect language with Diné culture and community responsibility. That does not mean outsiders should claim access to every teaching practice or cultural teaching. Many forms of knowledge are properly held within families and communities. Respecting the language's future includes respecting those limits. A documentary can describe public educational programs without turning Diné life into a display. If you've ever learned a language from a parent or grandparent, think about the first phrase that made you feel you belonged. That is the kind of daily connection these programs are trying to make possible again. There is another reason the classroom matters. It creates a public answer to an old public policy. The boarding school era treated native language as something to discipline out of children. A Diné immersion program states, through staffing and curriculum, that the language belongs in the future of Navajo education. That answer should not be confused with a reversal of history. No curriculum can remove the experiences of people who were punished or separated from their language. No school program can speak for every survivor or every family. What it can do is create a different condition for those who come after, a place where speaking Diné Bizard is expected, useful, and heard. The final question is what this changes in the larger story. Is language revival mainly a cultural project, or is it also a record of political authority? The evidence points to both. The language returns through voices, but the ability to support those voices through Navajo-controlled institutions is part of sovereignty itself. There is a practical reason to keep both levels in view. If language work is described only as private family devotion, the public obligations of schools and governments can disappear. If it is described only as a formal program, the household conversations that make language natural can disappear. The public materials point toward a partnership. Education can create structure, while speakers give structure its living purpose. That partnership also helps explain why a workbook, a classroom routine, or a teacher's preparation time deserves historical attention. They are not grand monuments. They are the small infrastructure of continuity. A policy once tried to restrict the language through everyday school routines. The response has to be equally everyday. More chances to hear, use, read, and answer in Diné Bizard. The survival of Diné Bizard cannot be credited to one program, one school, or one generation. It belongs to people who continued speaking when public policy gave them reasons to stop. It belongs to parents who passed on words, to grandparents who answered children, to teachers who built lessons, and to Navajo institutions that treated language as a responsibility rather than a relic. The historical sequence is clear. Federal boarding schools were created to assimilate native children. Language prohibition was one of the tools of that system. The policy placed pressure on Diné families and altered relationships between home, school, and speech. Later, Navajo educators developed language and culture frameworks and created immersion materials intended for Diné students. the direction of authority changed from suppressing a language to supporting its transmission. But the sequence is not a neat story of loss followed by recovery. It contains gaps, uneven access, and work that continues. Some children grow up hearing Dina Bizard every day. Some encounter it mostly in school. Some adults want to reclaim words that earlier generations were discouraged from using. Some communities have more resources than others. Public documents can describe programs and policies, but they cannot measure every family's relationship to the language. That limit matters because it keeps the documentary honest. We do not need to say that Dina Bizard was ever gone in order to make its endurance meaningful. It was carried by speakers. We do not need to promise that revival is complete in order to recognize what Navajo educators have built. Their work is visible in curriculum frameworks, immersion handbooks, assessments, books, and the ordinary act of conducting a school day in Dina Bizard. The contrast with the old system becomes clearest in a small classroom action. A teacher asks a question in Dina Bizard. A child responds. The answer is understood. Nothing dramatic happens. There is no federal official in the room and no historical monument on the wall, yet that exchange reverses the logic of assimilation. The language is not a violation of the lesson. It is the medium of the lesson. This is also why language belongs in the history of sovereignty. A government has laws, offices, and elections. It also has the ability to decide what education will value. When the Navajo Nation develops standards for Dini culture and language, it is exercising authority over the future of its own students. That authority does not eliminate the effects of federal policy, but it changes who writes the next rule. The evidence does not establish a single universal path for revitalization. Different Diné communities and families make different choices, nor does it give an outsider the right to prescribe how a language should be taught. Those decisions belong with Diné speakers, educators, families, and institutions. The public record only allows us to see that they have built real structures to support the work. Return to the old rule about speech. It attempted to make an indigenous language disappear from the classroom by making children afraid to use it. The lasting answer was not one heroic moment. It was continuity, a speaker refusing to let words end with them, a family keeping a conversation alive, and a teacher making room for those words in a new generation's education. That is how the Navajo language survived the schools that tried to silence it. Not untouched, not automatically, and not by accident. It survived because Diné people carried it beyond the reach of a school rule. It continues because Diné people are deciding in homes and in Navajo-controlled classrooms that the next generation should be able to speak and be understood. The quietness of that conclusion is part of its strength. It does not ask viewers to mistake a workbook for a cure or a school program for the whole of Diné life. It asks them to notice what the records make visible. Education can either make a child's first language feel unsafe or make room for that language to grow. The choice is never abstract when it reaches a classroom. For the Navajo Nation, the contemporary public record shows language educators, curriculum writers, families, and students carrying that choice forward. Their work will not be measured only by a historical commemoration. It will be measured in future conversations, whether a child can ask, answer, joke, learn, and belong in Diné Bizard.